This nugget is about pollination and fertilization in plants. In this nugget, we are going to describe how pollen is carried during pollination and the process of fertilization in plants. We'll then explain how plants reproduce sexually. The key words include sexual reproduction, pollen, ovum, pollination, fertilization, and nectar. Pollination. So what is pollination? Have you heard of this before and know what it is? In the sexual reproduction of plants, the pollen has to be carried from one plant to another. Pollination is the carrying of the pollen from the anther of one flower, to the stigma of another. Pollen can be carried by insects such as bees, or it can be carried by the wind. Let's have a look at how pollination happens by insects. Some flowers make a sweet liquid called nectar that is in the middle of the flower, and they have brightly coloured petals to attract insects. So the insect will be attracted to the flower and feeds on the nectar. As it does this, the pollen from the anther will get onto the insect as it crawls into the flower. The insect then flies over to another flower, and the pollen will brush off from the insect onto the stigma of the next plant it visits. Pollination by the wind. Grass is an example of a plant that has its pollen carried from one plant to another by the wind. The pollen grains of grass are very small and light, and the flowers don't need to be big and colourful to attract insects. So the pollen can be carried by the wind to another flower. Sometimes the pollen from one flower can be carried back to the stigma of the same flower. This is called self-pollination. Fertilization. Do you know what happens in fertilization for plants? First of all, the pollen that has been brought by pollination will land on the stigma of a flower. Remember, the stigma is sticky, so it's ready to catch the pollen. The pollen then travels down the pollen tube in the style to the ovary that's in the centre of the flower. At the ovary, the pollen can then join an ovum. The joining of the pollen and the ovum is called fertilization. After fertilization, the fertilized ovum starts to grow into a seed. The petals then die and the ovary becomes a fruit. Summary. In summary, we now know that pollination and fertilization occur during sexual reproduction for plants. Pollination is the carrying of pollen from the stigma of plants, and fertilization is the joining of the pollen and an ovum to form a seed. The key terms we used were sexual reproduction, so the making of plants using the male and female parts of the plant, pollen, which are tiny grains that are made by the male part of the plant, ovum, one of the eggs that is in the flower of the plant, pollination, which is the carrying of pollen from one flower to another, fertilization, where the pollen grain meets the ovum, and nectar, a sweet liquid made by flowers to attract insects.